All right, so get this. You sent in a ton of material about ancient Egypt.
Wow.
Yeah, it looks like you want to really get past just the pyramids this time and dig deep into this entire civilization.
Dig in, yeah.
Smart move.
It's a fascinating one, I'll tell you that.
Oh, yeah. And the main source we're using for this deep dive, an audio documentary.
Right.
And it's called The Entire History of Egypt, Ancient Civilizations Documentary.
Catchy.
I know, right? It's a mouthful, but it covers everything.
Okay.
From like the really early settlements before there even were pharaohs,
right,
all the way to the end of their empire.
The whole thing.
Yeah, the whole shebang. So we've got a lot to cover.
Yeah, and it's interesting because our understanding of ancient Egypt didn't actually start in Egypt.
Oh, really?
It started with the discovery of the Rosetta Stone in 1799 by a French soldier of all people.
Talk about a lucky break.
I know, right?
Not every day you just stumble upon the key to like a whole civilization's secrets.
Right. So the Rosetta Stone was crucial because it had the same text in 3 different scripts.
Oh, wow.
Including hieroglyphics. So it's like finding this giant decoder ring.
But without the Rosetta Stone, we might still be trying to figure out what all those hieroglyphs meant.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Imagine trying to understand a whole culture, but not being able to read what they wrote.
Yeah.
It'd be like solving a puzzle with like half the pieces missing.
Totally. This documentary makes a really interesting point about the Nile River.
Okay.
It quotes Herodotus, who said, Egypt is the gift of the Nile. I mean, we all know the Nile was super important to them, but I never really thought of it as like a gift.
Yeah, it's a powerful metaphor, and Herodotus wasn't exaggerating.
Okay.
The Nile was like the lifeblood of ancient Egypt.
Yeah.
You know, their whole civilization. The annual floods were crucial.
Right.
They would deposit all this rich, fertile soil along the banks.
Oh, so that's how they could farm in the desert.
Exactly. It made agriculture possible.
So it wasn't even just about having water to drink. It was about water that made the land come to life.
Right. And we have evidence of agriculture in Egypt going all the way back to 4600 to 4250 BC.
Wow.
And that comes from carbon dating of materials found at the Fayum Oasis.
So they were farming even before they had like irrigation systems and stuff.
Pretty much they were working with what the Nile gave them each year.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and those early farming communities grew into these complex societies.
Right.
We call this the pre-dynastic period.
Pre-dynastic.
Meaning before the time of the pharaohs.
Gotcha.
Now there aren't that many written records from this time.
So how do we even know about them?
Well, archaeologists are like detectives.
Right.
They dig up these clues and try to piece together the story.
So what kind of clues are we talking about?
We're talking artifacts, pottery tools, jewelry, even tombs.
Oh, wow.
And by studying all these objects, they've identified several different cultures that lived in pre-dynastic Egypt.
The documentary mentioned a few, like Helvankat and Sibelian and Gerzean.
Yeah.
They all sound like places you'd see on a map.
Well, they were.
Really?
And each one represents a different region and a different stage of development.
Okay. From
early hunter-gatherers to more settled farming communities.
Wow. And get this, they said some of them were already practicing mummification as early as 3500 BC.
Yeah.
Wait, well, so mummies weren't just a pharaoh thing.
Yep.
These early Egyptians were already preserving their dead. That's crazy.
It is pretty mind-blowing when you think about it.
It is.
Shows how deeply they believed in the afterlife, even way back then.
Yeah.
And as these communities developed, they eventually formed 2 distinct kingdoms.
Okay.
Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt.
Now, this isn't about geography, right?
You got it.
So, Upper Egypt isn't like actually above Lower Egypt on a map?
Nope. It's all about the flow of the Nile.
Okay.
Upper Egypt is in the south, where the Nile starts.
Right.
And Lower Egypt is in the north, where it flows out to the Mediterranean.
Okay, so each kingdom had its own crown.
Exactly.
Symbolizing their own power.
Yeah, their own identity.
So it was like 2 separate countries.
Pretty much, but then around 3000 BC, a king named Narmer steps onto the scene.
All right, what's the deal with this guy?
Narmer was the king of Upper Egypt, and he decided it was time to unify the 2 kingdoms.
Wow, so no more separate crowns?
Right, he combined them into that famous double crown, the Shent? Yeah, it was like a brilliant symbol of unity, showing he ruled over both Upper and Lower Egypt.
What a power move.
Totally, and this unification marked the beginning of what we call the early dynastic period.
Okay.
Which started around 3150 BC.
And dynastic means it's all about families.
Right.
Like the throne gets passed down
Exactly.
from one generation to the next.
You got it. And this early dynastic period is when we see a lot of the things we associate with ancient Egypt.
Like what?
like the concept of divine kingship,
Right.
the development of hieroglyphic writing,
Right.
and major advancements in arts and sciences.
Wow, it's like a cultural explosion.
It really is. And the documentary mentions a couple of key pharaohs from this period.
Like who?
Well, there's King Djoser,
Yep.
who built the first pyramid, the step pyramid at Saqqara.
I've heard of that one.
It's the oldest surviving stone monument in the world.
Wow, that's incredible.
I know, right? And it was designed by Djoser's chief architect, Imhotep,
Imhotep.
who was like a total Renaissance man.
What do you mean?
Well, he wasn't just an architect.
You know.
He was a doctor, a priest, and a writer.
Talk about multi-talented.
And later on, he was even worshipped as a god.
A god? Seriously?
Yeah, Imhotep was a true innovator, and his work on the step pyramid paved the way for all the more elaborate pyramids.
Oh, you mean the ones that came later during the Old Kingdom?
Exactly!
Ah, yes, the Old Kingdom, the pyramid building era.
It's when things get really interesting.
This is where it gets good. The documentary focuses on King Sneferu,
Oh!
who basically figured out how to build those perfect, smooth-sided pyramids.
Sneferu was a bit of a perfectionist.
Oh, yeah.
He built several pyramids, each one getting closer to that ideal shape. His first attempts, like the bent pyramid and the Maiden pyramid.
I've seen pictures. They look a little wonky.
Yeah, they had some design flaws, let's say.
But, hey, nobody's perfect.
True that.
He kept experimenting and finally got it right with the Red Pyramid.
The first true smooth-sided pyramid.
Exactly. And then his son, King Khufu,
Yeah.
took it to a whole other level with the Great Pyramid of Giza.
One of the most iconic structures in history.
I mean, even today.
Absolutely. The floods determined when they could plant and harvest their crops.
Oh, well.
And it also influenced labor practices.
How so?
Well, during flood season, when the fields were underwater, farmers would often be recruited to work on building projects.
Oh, so like pyramids and temples.
Exactly.
So the pyramids weren't just built by slaves like some people think.
No, not at all. It was a collaborative effort, and farmers were a vital part of the workforce.
That's interesting.
And, even though life for the average Egyptian was tough, they still found time for leisure activities.
Like what?
Well, the documentary mentioned board games, hunting,
None.
and even festivals with music and dancing.
So they knew how to have a good time.
It's important to remember that people in ancient times weren't just working all the time.
Right.
They had families, communities, and they found ways to enjoy life.
That's a good point. It's easy to get caught up in all the big historical events and forget about the human side of things.
Exactly. And as we go deeper into the story of ancient Egypt, we'll see how these cycles of power, innovation, and daily life played out over thousands of years.
I can't wait.
It's quite a story.
It is. All right, so we left off with ancient Egypt going through all these ups and downs, powerful pharaohs, everyday life on the Nile.
Right, lots of changes.
But then things take a pretty big turn, don't they?
They do. We're getting to a period where Egypt actually comes under the control of foreign powers, starting with Alexander the Great,
Oh, yeah.
conquering Egypt in 332 BC.
End of an era sounds dramatic.
It was a big deal. This marked the end of the Pharaonic era,
Wow.
the end of an independent Egypt. Well, at least for a while.
So what happened after Alexander the Great came in? Did everything just change overnight?
Not exactly. See, after Alexander died, his massive empire got divided up.
Oh, between his generals, right?
Yeah, and Egypt ended up in the hands of Ptolemy. That's order.
Ptolemy.
Yeah, he started a whole new dynasty, the Ptolemies.
Hold on. So now we've got Greeks running Egypt.
That's right.
That must have been a big adjustment for the Egyptians.
It was, but here's the thing about the Ptolemies.
What's that?
They were pretty clever rulers.
Okay.
They knew that to stay in charge, they couldn't just force Greek culture on everyone.
So they had to adapt a little bit.
Exactly. They actually presented themselves as pharaohs to the Egyptian people,
Really?
and they respected a lot of the old traditions.
Interesting. So they were kind of trying to blend in.
Yeah, you could say that they even supported the building of temples
Wow.
and kept a lot of the religious practices going.
So it was like this mix of Greek and Egyptian ways, a real cultural mashup.
You got it. And one of the biggest things that happened during this time was the founding of Alexandria,
Alexander.
named after Alexander the Great, of course.
Makes sense.
It became the capital of Ptolemaic Egypt,
Okay.
and this incredible center of learning and culture.
I've always heard about its famous library.
The Library of Alexandria was legendary. Think massive collections of scrolls and texts, scholars from all over the ancient world coming to study there.
Wow, it was like the Google of its time.
Exactly, a treasure trove of knowledge. Sadly, it was destroyed.
Yeah, that's a real shame. Imagine all the history that was lost.
A huge loss. But even without the library, the Ptolemies left their mark.
In what way?
Well, they built these incredible temples dedicated to both Egyptian and Greek gods.
Really?
Yeah, a real sign of that cultural mix.
Wow.
The Temple of Horus at Edfu is a great example.
I've seen pictures. It's beautiful.
It's amazingly well preserved, and it shows how Egyptian art kept thriving even under foreign rule.
So this Ptolemaic period, it was a time of mixing traditions, new ideas coming in. It lasted for a while, right?
It did almost 300 years.
Wow.
But like all good things, it eventually came to an end.
What happened?
The Roman Empire was on the rise.
Oh, boy.
And in 30 BC, Cleopatra VII, the last Ptolemaic ruler,
Cleopatra.
yeah, she lost out to Octavian, who later became the Roman Emperor Augustus.
Cleopatra. Now, that's a name everyone knows.
Her story is full of drama, romance, you name it.
Yeah, definitely a dramatic end to an era.
And with her defeat, Egypt became part of the Roman Empire.
So new bosses in town again. Did the Romans crack down on Egyptian culture? Were they more like the Persians?
Actually, no, the Romans were a bit like the Ptolemies in that way.
How so?
They were pretty tolerant when it came to religion.
Okay.
They let Egyptians keep their traditions going.
Smart move. Keep the locals happy, less chance of a rebellion.
Exactly. But what about the rest of Egyptian society?
Yeah. Did the Romans change things much there?
Well, the Romans were mainly interested in Egypt for its grain.
Oh, yeah. Egypt was like the breadbasket of the ancient world.
Exactly. They saw it as this giant source of wealth.
Right.
So they set up a system to really maximize their profits.
So taxes, efficient administration, that kind of thing?
That's right. They were all about maximizing their resources. But here's the interesting thing.
Was that?
Even though they were focused on exploiting Egypt,
Okay.
they actually ended up contributing to its development. We'll think roads, canals, irrigation systems.
Oh, wow.
Things that made trade and communication easier.
It's like those unintended consequences, right?
You got it. They came to take what they could, but ended up leaving some good stuff behind.
So even with the Romans in charge, Egyptian culture kept going.
No, absolutely. Throughout this whole Roman period, you see Egyptian art and architecture evolving, sometimes mixing in some Roman and Greek influences.
Okay.
The Temple of Kom-Ombo is a great example.
The one dedicated to both the crocodile god Sobek and the falcon god Horus.
That's the one, two gods in one temple.
Yeah. Sounds like they were really mixing things up.
It shows how cultures can blend when they come into contact, finding ways to coexist. And even in death, you see this mix.
Really?
Yeah, mummy portraits from the Roman period often show people with Roman hairstyles and clothing.
But they're still being mummified.
Exactly, still following those traditional Egyptian burial practices.
Wow, holding on to their identity even in the afterlife. That's pretty powerful.
It is. And then there's another big shift coming. The spread of Christianity throughout the Roman Empire.
Ah, yes.
Egypt becomes a major early Christian center.
Right.
Monasteries and churches popping up everywhere.
Yeah, I know the Coptic Orthodox Church in Egypt traces its roots back to those early Christian communities.
Exactly. And get this, the Coptic language.
Which is a descendant of ancient Egyptian.
It is, and it's still used in their church services today.
Wow, that's incredible. It's like a direct link to the ancient pharaohs.
A living connection to the past, but with Christianity on the rise, what happened to the old Egyptian religion?
Yeah, good question. Did it just disappear?
It was a slow decline. The Romans were generally tolerant,
Right.
but they did crack down on certain cults they saw as dangerous.
Okay.
And as more people converted to Christianity, those ancient temples were gradually abandoned. The priests lost their influence.
It's kind of sad to see such an old and vibrant religious tradition fade away.
It is, but cultures change, religions evolve.
That's true.
Christianity didn't completely erase the past, but it definitely transformed the religious landscape of Egypt.
A new chapter in the long story of Egypt, and it's a story that's still being written, isn't it?
Absolutely. The legacy of ancient Egypt is woven into the fabric of the country today.
I could see that.
The language, the traditions, those incredible monuments, they continue to fascinate and inspire people all over the world.
It just goes to show, the past is always present in a way, shaping the world we live in.
Well said. And speaking of shaping the world, our next stop takes us to another major turning point.
Okay, I'm ready.
The arrival of Islam in Egypt.
Right, things are about to get even more interesting.
This is where things really start to shift.
Okay, so we've seen Egypt go through like all these changes, right? Pharaohs, Greeks, Romans, even the rise of Christianity.
Lots of changes.
And now we're talking about the arrival of Islam. Like, that's a whole new ballgame.
Yeah, it's a huge turning point in the 7th century AD. These Arab armies carrying the message of Islam, they swept across North Africa.
Wow.
And Egypt, which was under the Byzantine Empire at the time, fell to them in 641 AD.
This documentary makes a really interesting point, though.
Go, yeah.
It says that the Arab conquest of Egypt was pretty quick and relatively peaceful,
Hmm.
especially compared to, like, all the battles and power struggles we've talked about already.
It is a bit unexpected, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So what's the explanation for that?
Well, the reasons are complex, but part of it was that the Byzantine rulers weren't very popular.
Go.
Many Egyptians, especially the Coptic Christians, saw them as oppressors.
So the Byzantines weren't exactly winning any popularity contests.
Not really.
So does that mean that some Egyptians actually welcomed the Arab armies?
Some did. They saw the Arabs as liberators.
Wow.
And the Arabs also offered religious tolerance to Christians and
Oh, that's
Jews,
interesting.
allowed them to practice their faiths as long as they paid a special tax.
Smart strategy, less resistance that way makes the transition smoother.
Exactly. But even with tolerance, Islam coming in definitely changed Egyptian society and culture.
Yeah, in a big way.
It did. Arabic became the official language, replacing Greek and Coptic, and Islamic law and customs were gradually integrated into Egyptian life.
So it wasn't like a complete overnight change.
No, more of a gradual shift.
Interesting. So the early Arab rulers were pretty practical about it.
They knew they couldn't just erase centuries of tradition,
Right.
but over time, Islam did become the dominant religion,
Okay.
and Egypt became this major center of Islamic learning and scholarship.
The documentary mentioned the founding of Cairo in 969 AD
Yeah.
by the Fatimid dynasty.
Ah, Cairo, the city of 1,000 minarets.
That's a great nickname.
It is. It quickly became a major power player in the Islamic world,
Wow.
even surpassing Alexandria in importance.
So a new capital, a new center of influence.
Yeah.
What were some of the big developments during this whole Islamic period?
Well, Islamic art and architecture flourished.
Okay.
Think magnificent mosques, elaborate palaces,
I've seen pictures. Those are incredible.
and madrasas. Those are religious schools.
Right.
They all featured these intricate geometric patterns.
Beautiful calligraphy.
Yeah, inspired by Islamic tradition.
The documentary highlighted the Mosque of Ibn Tulun.
Oh, yeah.
They said it's one of the oldest and best preserved examples of Islamic architecture in Egypt.
It's a masterpiece.
And they said that architectural brilliance continued through the centuries.
Oh, did.
You mentioned the Al-Azhar Mosque.
Yeah.
The Mosque of Muhammad Ali.
All showcasing that incredible artistic skill and creativity.
So it wasn't just about bringing in new styles.
Yeah.
It was about blending them with what was already there.
Exactly. That mix of influences is fascinating.
It is. It really is. And you see that in other areas too, right?
Yeah.
Like the documentary mentioned Sufi mysticism,
Oh, yeah.
which is all about a personal connection with God.
Right. It became very popular in Egypt.
And it actually incorporated some ancient Egyptian beliefs.
It did, like about the afterlife
Mm.
and the importance of rituals.
So even though the old Egyptian religion had faded, some of its core ideas lived on within Islam.
That's a great point. It shows how resilient Egyptian culture was. Even with these massive religious and political changes happening, the essence of their beliefs and traditions found ways to endure.
Okay, so we've got the Fatimids establishing Cairo, who comes after them. Were there any other important dynasties during this Islamic period?
Oh, yeah. Egypt saw several powerful dynasties rise and fall, each one leaving their own mark on the country.
Like who?
Well, you have the Ayyubid dynasty founded by Saladin,
Oh, yes, Saladin.
the Kurdish warrior who famously defeated the Crusaders.
I've heard of him. He was, respected even by his enemies.
He was a truly remarkable figure,
Yeah.
and under the Ayyubids, Cairo continued to thrive as the center of trade and learning.
Okay.
And then came the Mamluk dynasty.
The Mamluks.
Now, this one's unique because they were actually ruled by slave soldiers.
Wait, slave soldiers running an empire?
I know it sounds strange, right?
Yeah, how did that even happen?
All the Mamluks were a formidable force. They actually defeated the Mongols
Wow,
and drove out the remaining Crusaders from the Holy Land.
incredible.
They were also great patrons of the arts and sciences,
Oh, really?
leading to what's considered a golden age of Mamluk culture.
But even the Mamluks eventually lost their grip on power, right? So who took over?
In the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire,
Ah, the Ottomans.
centered in Turkey, conquered Egypt, adding it to their vast domain.
Wow.
And they ruled for almost 300 years.
Another empire enters the scene. So what was their impact on Egypt?
It was kind of a mixed bag, really.
Right.
They brought stability, but they also took a lot of wealth out of Egypt.
Oh, so not so good for the economy.
Not really. It hurt their economic development.
Sounds familiar. A powerful empire comes in, takes resources, not always the best thing for the locals.
That's a common story throughout history.
Sadly, yeah.
But it's important to remember that even under Ottoman rule, Egyptian culture didn't just disappear.
Right.
Cairo remained this important center of Islamic scholarship.
Oh, okay.
And Egyptian artists and craftsmen continued to create beautiful works.
So even under foreign rule, they held on to their identity.
Exactly. And as we move into the 19th century,
We're getting closer to modern times now.
we see the rise of Egyptian nationalism.
A desire to break free from the Ottomans.
Yeah, they wanted to chart their own course.
That struggle for independence must have been huge for Egypt's future.
Absolutely pivotal, and that's where our deep dive ends for now,
Already?
leaving you on the cusp of modern Egypt's emergence.
Wow, what a journey.
We've covered thousands of years.
From the first pharaohs to the arrival of Islam, the rise and fall of empires, the blending of cultures.
It's truly a remarkable story.
It really is. I'm amazed by how much the civilization went through, how it adapted, reinvented itself, but always held onto its unique identity. It makes you want to keep learning.
It does.
And to dig even deeper into all those stories that are still waiting to be uncovered.
That's the beauty of history. It sparks our curiosity.
It does.
And it reminds us that the past is never truly gone. It's all around us, shaping the present and the future.
So well said.
So as you continue exploring ancient Egypt, keep asking questions, keep digging, and who knows what amazing discoveries you'll make.
Great advice. Thanks for being such an awesome guide through this deep dive.
My pleasure.
It's been a real eye-opener. And to everyone listening, keep exploring, keep learning, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.